All right, so I think we might have an hour, Tony, before our guest shows
No,
up.
he's here.
Oh, is he?
It's 10:30. Actually, we're a
Oh, right
little bit
on.
behind. I
I
think
thought
he's
maybe he
ready to
was
go.
like Central Time, and
I think we sent. I wasn't sure. I just suggested. I wasn't sure if he was later time zone or like West Coast or something, Mountain West, something like that. So but he agreed to come on at 10:30. So I think he's ready to go.
right on.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're pleased to welcome back Matthew Ehret. He's an author. He's a researcher. He's a historian, and I thought among his recent projects that we want to talk about, I also thought it would be cool if he checked out this book that we acquired this week, and it's the Two Faces of George Bush. It might have some interesting information in there for talking about later. But first, Matthew, how are you, man? Good to see you.
Hey guys, yeah, I'm doing really well. How are y'all doing?
We're staying up late just for you.
What time zone are you in, by the way? I'm in the Eastern
Oh,
time.
you're Eastern. Okay.
Yeah, we're all on the East Coast over here.
Good.
Control room is usually on West Coast, but Justin is now on East Coast too. So
Okay, so this is like it's a late night show for you guys.
Yeah,
too.
and we're just getting warmed up tonight, so we got another like 6 hours to go. Good to see you.
Likewise.
What have you been up to lately, man? What do you got to share?
Oh, busy. Well, I've just been going through the ringer, just doing a lot of interviews to try to bring some light to the third volume of my book series. So we've got 3 volumes out now, and so that's been fun. And I've just teamed up with a talented multimedia guy. So I've been trying to make videos for a long time, and I was despairing. I just gave up on the project because I was looking for somebody who had a multifaceted appreciation for various types of software, audio, visual skills. And I just couldn't find somebody with the skill set until I was at the Freedom Convoy this year. And I met a talented guy named Jason Dahl, whose business took a big hit over COVID, but he had a skill set out of the wazoo. And so we've been making videos now, taking little sections from my books, turn them into little micro history documentaries. And we did a couple of more recent big ones, bigger, 20-minute videos. So that's been fun, just trying to find a new way of shaping or influencing the zeitgeist in any possible way that I can. So that's been useful.
Well, I follow you on Substack, and you're a heck of a productive writer, right? You like consistently churning out new good research. And I think that
on very like complex topics,
yeah, of course,
like essentially historiographies that go back centuries, you're helping to sort of bring a dialectic that is much needed to a lot of these historical narratives. One that we've talked about many times, for example, in the town hall was in regards to Kessler's book in the 13th Tribe. We had a little bit of discussion about that in the Khazarian Revolution. And so as helping to provide that counter dialectic and your just historical analysis, really, I wish you could, and at some point, maybe I'll try to clip those out for you just to see the sort of discussion it was able to generate. So really appreciate your erudite work. It's astounding.
Yeah, I really,
go ahead.
Yeah, go on. Sorry, Richard, go for it.
Well, I was going to say that I'm really glad you got a multimedia guy now, because one of the few places I do agree with Alan Dulles on is that the public doesn't read, and that's part of the problem. And what you're doing is with these short videos, these micro documentaries, you're giving people substantial knowledge. You're getting their attention, their interest, and providing them some value, and that gives them the reason to go and read the rest of it.
Yeah, that's always the trick, right? Not to give them so much that their minds turn off because they feel satisfied, but give them just enough that they want more, so that they might want to do some mind work that otherwise they would not have been stimulated to do. So hopefully, I try to make it very, very clear that if you really want more, if you got your mind blown even a little bit on some of these, origins of the deep state in North America stuff or anything, the book is right here. Please have more surprises, but make more discoveries. So
I think it comes down to people like rewiring their dopamine, right? Yeah. Right now, social media and our culture has them getting their dopamine hits in very unhealthy, hollow, superficial, empty calorie type of way. And when they can learn to like pick up a good book after reading something or hearing something and say, I want to go learn more about that and consume the whole thing and grow in big chunks. Instead of like these little 8-second, 240 character type things, man, it stunts people's growth and it arrests their development. And what I see you doing is saying, you guys can go further. You're like it's a Jocko Willink approach of saying, you you and Johnny Vedmore are out there leading people to say, look, you have superficial knowledge of these topics. Here's just an article about that, and it's going to show you how much you don't know, so you'd actually want to go read the books.
Right. Well, that's what I like about you guys, because you're always trying to find, you take every opportunity that presents itself to get across that, by the way, if you really want to know this thing we're talking about, read this book. Here's the name, and that was one of the early, I think, positive intuitions I had when I was just trying to figure things out early on, when we all go through the same sort of traumatic process, was that I, at least when I would hear somebody who seemed to have some wisdom, who had been through the fire and came out of it with real knowledge, I made, whether it was Mike Rupert or anybody, I would listen to a lecture and they said that they read something. I would take note and I would try to find that book to try to reproduce in my mind what their minds went through to come to real knowledge. And it's not esoteric or mystical or difficult. It's just, it takes a little bit of patience. It means switching off a little bit and just taking the time to spend a couple of hours over a few consecutive days of reading and taking notes of your thoughts while you're reading. So you're both, it's more of an engaging, active process, and you're not just trying to consume. But that's really it. And you'll find when you walk away, even though it's an enjoyable, solemn process with you and yourself and your mind and the person who wrote the book, that's all it is. You walk away with a deeper quality of knowledge, and then the roots are just deeper, right? So you can use that in a way that you couldn't if you were just getting blips of trivia on social media, which turns into noise very easily. And you walk away, and I walk away. I mean, from sometimes, I think we all go through just our scrolling on Telegram or whatever social media people are using. And I feel it, where my mind is just like a buzz with just information overload. And I'm like, okay, I just spent 3 hours scrolling, getting blips of little interesting videos and little mini articles. And I don't think I can talk about anything I just read. That's not useful.
Yeah. Like, what are we getting as return on our investment, or are we spending time in a way that it's a liability and it doesn't give us anything useful for the future? Like you said, trivial, things that, like, little nuggets of knowledge. Like, they used to have that game Trivial Pursuit back in the 80s. And it's about a whole bunch of incoherent, chaotic knowledge. That's like, this is a knowledge nugget that is useless in adult life to meet
Jeopardy
your responsibilities.
Yeah.
Exactly. You don't see any billionaires going on Jeopardy. Right. So there's a different mind to make money than it does to recall stuff out of the phone book.
And to your point, Matt, the active versus passive process, when we're engaging with these mediums, these televised mediums, it creates this whole different dynamic. I know Marcia McLuhan talked about this. The medium is the message, and how these artificial apparatuses sort of condition the way in which we receive the information. There's something fundamentally different about reading a book that is much more active. You're in a way like talking to yourself in your head, working out complex ideas, and it's a test of both one's mental energy, acuity, but also, like, there's a stimulation that comes with it that is, to Rich's point about dopamine, much more satisfying over a longer period of time. And that's something runs counter factual to what we experience in our culture today, where everything is quick cuts, quick edits, flashy, news items, flashy colors, whatever. And that's sort of creates this cognitive dissonance, this disconnection in the mind. And so getting back into to me, it's like a meditation. Getting back into the idea of reading is really going to help one develop quite literally their mental muscle, and also develop their rational processes. Because all of a sudden you may not agree with everything you read, and you may stop and think for a second, instead of just you heard someone say something and then you're on to the next clip. You heard now someone else is talking about it, and these quick cuts, these hot takes, and all that stuff that we get through.
When you can get wrapped up too when you do that. So, like, as part of surveying information, it's like, okay, I don't understand this, or I disagree with this, or what have you. That can snag you and stop you from consuming the whole article. And what I usually do is like, well, why do I disagree with it? And if I can articulate readily, okay, then I'll keep reading. Or does it matter that I disagree with this? Right? He thinks orange is the best color. I think blue is the best color. Do I have to stop reading the article? So I'm going to just hold that off to the side while I consume the rest of the article. And then when it comes to the conclusion I'm supposed to take away from that, I'm going to ask, does it matter which color? No, it doesn't. So I'm going to go with the conclusion that made sense in reality and reflects truth.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've had the same experience, but I've had this occur on several occasions where seemingly not erudite, maybe that's too strong of a word, educated, literate people actually told me directly that they didn't want to read the thing I was suggesting that they read, even if it was like a leaflet or, you know, a small article, because it might influence them. And in my mind, I'm just thinking, what are you saying? Like, it might influence you? Well, I hope it does. That's why I'm giving it to you. But the point is, like, how can you be so unconfident with your own power of judgment and reason that you're afraid you might be persuaded to think something you don't currently think now if you just read something you might not disagree with at the moment? I think it just speaks to the incompetence of our education system, which really just tunes people to want to find the right answer and the right opinions to pass the test, rather than thinking for themselves. You know, people start asking, well, what are the rules before they even understand what the question is? And it's like, if you condition yourself too long in that type of environment over years, and you come out, you have no confidence in your own mind's ability to use your own God-given endowed reason to think through things on your own. And like you said, just reserve judgment, just read things that you don't necessarily believe or know about already. How else are you going to discover something new unless you read things you don't already think are true? And reserve judgment. You know, if something, you know, if somebody has an opinion that might spring a red alarm bell or rub you the wrong way, put it aside. Maybe they have something else that they're thinking about. Maybe they've made a discovery that you haven't discovered. Or maybe they're wrong about something, but they might have a good opinion on something else. But whatever. Point is, you can, you know, if you're open, you will be able to come out of it with more insight, even if it's negative knowledge. Like you'll understand better why you didn't think that. Maybe you had the right opinion, but you didn't really hone that opinion. You didn't test it enough. And so, you know, it's another way of challenging yourself to try to defend your opinion, and you'll come out with your opinion, but even more healthy and more deeply rooted to carry out further battles in the future, you know? But
I don't think they want that
consensus.
I don't think they want that going on at all.
That's
No,
the outcome-based education, right? I mean, essentially, that's the whole point. In regards to, I call it creating a ad veracundium complex, which is just an appeal to authority complex. You don't have confidence in your own ability to make discernments and decisions and judgments about what you experience, how you understand the world, and who you will, you know, the arguments that you find interesting or not. Nope, you have to rely on someone else to fill that void, and that's the key about the semantic game of controlling language, which seems to be so much that's rife in the culture right now. It's a scary thing, but at the same time, if we can utilize this technology, much like you did with your most recent little documentary short in regard to journalist Smedley Butler at War is a Racket and the Bankers Coup, and get people interested without giving it too much, because that is a problem. I remember Joe Rogan once saying, man, if they could just make more documentaries, because who wants to read? And I'm thinking like, oh man, if only we could incentivize people about training themselves in the art of reading and sort of the meditative process that comes with that. I call it, you know, it's that sort of intellectual muscle, I call it the wisdom muscle, really, because it really focuses you, as you said, Matt, an active process to sit down and engage with it in a whole different way. It's a whole different medium of the way in which we actually take in information when we read. That has actual physiological effects. We're quite literally burn more calories, like a chess player or something like that. We're actually quite literally more engaged with trying to understand and utilizing that voice in the head and playing that dialectical game, which is so important to develop one's rational process.
You know, one thing I was thinking about regarding the question of the active experience of reading, but also it became more visceral for me when I started finding myself composing more, writing first, and then doing more interviews and shows and hosting things, is that I found more value. Things shifted gears in a positive way when I began to think more about the question orientation to composition rather than the answer orientation. Because at first you're thinking, okay, I'm going to write something because I want to say what I know to people, and I'm going to be polemical or whatever. Or same thing when I'm speaking. I want to say what I know because I want to persuade you. Right. And generally, it's still what I want. I obviously want to persuade people of things, but it became more useful when I was like, okay, well, rather than just try to think about the things I'm going to say, I'm going to think about the questions. So what were the questions in my mind that got me into a process that resulted in conclusions, and how can I make that transparent as possible to my audience? Which is what Socrates, you know, we talked last time we had this conversation. That's the whole point of when we
talk about Kepler too, that was the whole, you know, when we think about the Copernicus, Kepler, even Sir Isaac Newton, Leibniz, like these individuals were like inductive method essentially, or just they had they approached the process of discovery as though it was something they were completely engaged in. It was a fundamental sort of difference. Instead of like, here's the theory and let's fit everything into this. No, they were in a state where they were open to a whole host of different ideas, viewpoints, arguments, and they didn't
have TV to tell them what was true, Tony, so they had to do stuff like that. Can't you see the progress we've made? We're so smart, we don't have to use our brains anymore.
It's important. You said something here, Matt, that's really important. When I teach the trivium in classical rhetoric, you say you start with questions. And my mentor, Gino Denning, who introduced the trivium to our community many, many years ago, he always said to me, are you dealing with someone that's on a quest for truth? Or are you dealing with someone that already has a belief they want to prove to you? And so with your point, starting with a question is extremely powerful, because in that it's now a process. It's a journey we can go on together to see if we can discover something truthful or not about what we're
it's also where thinking starts,
instead of just starting with
and not assuming.
Yeah.
So it's a good place to start.
That's a powerful sort of way to engage rhetorical composition or interviews. I like that. That's a fantastic heuristic or technique to follow in rhetoric. So kudos.
It's just healthy, right? It's just like humility. Like that's one of the. How do you have a fertile soil to find any like make something new, to create something new, or to discover something new, if you don't already have a heart that's open and that's humble? If you're arrogantly going in just to prove your case to others, you don't really have you might have the semblance of a curious personality, but you're actually not. Your heart's closed. So humility is important, to be able to say, okay, I love the truth more than I love my system. As much as my system might have even worked for me and got me money and maybe got me admiration from my colleagues or whatever, I'm more happy to burn down, to break my own system when I find that it doesn't work, when I map it onto reality and there's breaks, there's crinks, there's ripples that can't be ironed away without me hurting my conscience. And so I'm willing to like think about something outside of my system that brings me into more congruence with discoverable reality. And even, and that's we love it when people tell us their transformative processes, right? Like, I think it was you mentioned, was it Lovejoy? Was that him who came up with the Gaia theory that you brought up earlier? Was it Lovejoy?
Lovejoy.
It was him, right?
I think so. Either that, or I was thinking of
I was thinking of L. Ron Hubbard, but I think that was Scientology or something. I know
that's definitely Scientology. I think Lovejoy was the guy who had the idea of the Gaia.
I think it
Gaia
came from the
hypothesis.
Teilhard de Chardin, I believe, which the concept of a noosphere, right, and sort of and he sort of took the Hegelian dynamic of the metaphysics of essentially the zeitgeist at the time being wrapped up in history, that it's going to end in sort of spiritual evolution of like a man that is like part of some sort of collective consciousness or something of that nature through Gaia.
I have that book with the intro by Julian Huxley.
Yes, we had on the show a couple, and I was thinking, like, see the tripartite nature to the way he splits out these antinomies and then he finds resolution. I'm like, this is fast. I'm like, this is Hegelian. And so I had to,
he definitely knows. Well, him and I just brought up Lovejoy because I know later on in life, he actually turns and actually says, no, he has a bit of a positive conversion towards realizing where he went wrong earlier on, and becomes a proponent for nuclear power, for high technology that he had formerly said was anti-nature. But
his activists never got the memo.
No, exactly. Well, it's like Heisenberg too, right? Like later on in life, Heisenberg, when he's like in his late 70s, he gives a lecture where he says, people have to revisit Plato's Timaeus. This whole idea of probability theory, I think it turned into a monster. And even him,
100%,
yeah, he got the ball rolling on this thing, and he was like, he at least had a fertile mind, whereas the little automatons that were influenced by the thing he put into motion were just like, no, there's no such thing as truth. It's just, whatever your probability statistics determine may be reality. That's all that there is. And
that was the Copenhagen interpretation in the 1930s of quantum mechanics, where they said truth is unknowable, cause and effect does not exist. We're not sure if it's a wave or a particle, depending on observation and measurement. And so there's all these irrational. I mean, they got to the point where it wasn't just relative based on space and time, like a four-dimensional manifold. Now it's like there's no way we can. There's no assumption that there's a reality at all. And that was actually like
there's no reality.
There's no
everything else goes.
Yes, and they were literal about this. I have actual quotes from the founding sort of fathers of the Copenhagen interpretation, talking about de Broglie and there's a couple other ones.
Niels Bohr.
I would have loved to turn off
of course,
their
Bohr.
electricity in the middle of their email. Like they're trying to
Schrodinger.
like send off a hot take on something and turn off their electricity. It's like, oh, bro, why'd you do that to yourself? Sorry about that. Wasn't us cutting the power to your house. No, that was you that did that to yourself, because that's human. And
Well, it comes from Ernst Mach, as a positivist, and you get this sort of analytic tradition in the United States, unfortunately, where they dispense with metaphysics. To your point, like Plato's Timaeus is arguably, if not that and the Parmenides, are my two favorite dialogues by Plato. But yeah, I mean, hyper important, the idea of being able to understand the value of a first principle. And yeah, in a way, you were talking about, your conscience, and in regards to, you have certain values and principles that you're willing to, not willing to necessarily sacrifice, in regards to, like, if this is the truth, I'm going to, and that principle, in other words, is truth for you. So you're willing to put away your ideology at certain, and that's one of the most difficult things to inculcate in one's mind, body, spirit disposition, if you will. But for those that can, it is one of the most freeing aspects, because then it opens up a world of possibility, and what we can actually understand, and what confidence we have in what we can understand about our world. So.
Absolutely. And that carries into the discussion you were also saying about, because I see that there's like a bit of a theme regarding technology and the mind's powers, and Marshall McLuhan. And there's a certain, I think, paradox that one could walk into, and I think a lot of people do, which is that, the more you have information technologies increasing and advancing, the less you need to use a lot of your memory muscles that the previous state of that society, ignorant of those technologies, had to use, right? Before the written word, you had to use a lot more of the memory muscle. You had to memorize things like Homer's Iliad or the Vedas, and there's a certain rhythmic verse quality to it that made it a little bit more easy to stick within the memory. But I mean, these are voluminous pieces of, oh my God, it's incredible to think how that was like passed on. That was a normal part of a good quality education. Not that everyone had education, but still. And then now, when you can write things down, you don't need to remember those things anymore. And that in some ways frees you up, but in other ways it atrophies you. And it's like that for, I think the problem with McLuhan, or at least people who interpret McLuhan, I don't know if he thought this, is that it takes you into a bit of a predeterministic way, which almost makes it seem like technology can do nothing but destroy the mind's ability to function well. And that if you continue on the process of advancing technology, the human powers are going to reduce in proportion to progress, to the point that you reach one of these, like, these singularities. This idea that, okay, at a certain moment in the future, we can project an overtaking of human mental powers by machine learning, which will render us irrelevant unless we merge with the machines and become relevant to avoid extinction or we'll just be crushed by the Terminators. And Teilhard de Chardin and Julian Huxley together, I don't think it's a coincidence that they were very close friends, and they both innovated the concept of transhumanism in 1955 together. That having their little back and forth discussions on how do you tweak Darwinism to accommodate
give it a teleology, give it a meaning now. Let's like give it a purpose and combine it with sort of the Hegelian ideas of like wrapping it up into a historical situation. We transcend our condition through this process, this 3-step process.
So what you're saying
religion's to be elite.
So what you're saying is basically we just go back to epic poems and iambic pentameter, and technocracy and transhumanism go away. Next week, we do it like that.
I think it's a good mental exercise to think like, maybe how do we both have the best of technology while at the same time exercising our
I agree. And like that's one of the biggest problems of
mental
Neil Postman, like you got to know about the edges of technology, and when you adopt a new technology, you lose something of the traditional natural world to get that new convenience. He wrote a lot about that. Like
who wrote that?
Neil Postman. He wrote "Amusing Ourselves to Death" and "Technopoly." Good read right here. "Technopoly" by Neil Postman. He died like 1992, or he died. I think maybe this is a 1992 book, and he died soon after that. But let's see. This is 1992. He wrote "Amusing Ourselves to Death," I think, before this one, because this is the surrender of our culture to technology. It's like the end of humanity. And he calls it out before the internet was even a real thing. Like this is, but if you look at how many pages I have highlighted and marked in this book that are important, like wisdom, it's a really good read. And it's not like 200 pages probably.
Yeah, I'll check that out.
It's interesting
Yeah.
about Marshall McLuhan. It's tough to interpret McLuhan. I just want to piggyback on something you said real quick. It's very difficult because a lot of times it's very easy to interpret in the sense that he was critiquing it always in a negative light. But sometimes you get the sense because he was such a devout Catholic, I think of the Roman Catholic tradition, but he spoke a lot on sort of the sort of like mystical elements of like the communion, the mass, transubstantiation, these sorts of concepts in the Catholic faith. Very interesting. He sort of saw technology, I think, at a time as the way we'd manifest like Christ or the Antichrist, at least as a metaphor. And so it's sort of a reflection back of our own soul's desires would be manifested through the medium of technology itself, both the worst and the best. And we'll have to make the decision or choice as to which one we'll choose as we move into a future together. That's sort of the way I interpreted some aspects of him, which is a unique and strange interpretation. But I don't know. That's something to sort of ponder and think about. Right. There's a lot of different ways in which McLuhan can be. He's a tough one to crack in regards to his writings.
Yeah, he really is. And I mean, I think I don't really know where to stand on him per se. I mean, there's definitely a lot of high value content in terms of the ideas that he put out there.
Right.
I don't know if he
was somewhat prophetic,
their followers said, and sometimes his followers can definitely turn into trend. Many of them find themselves in the transhumanist ilk, but I mean, not all of them are.
They do.
But definitely to be able to balance out, to both enjoy the fruits of progress and technology while at the same time grow, your psycho-spiritual powers to the best and fullest capability. I think to be able to do both of those would be to be able to manage a society that could create such institutions that could safeguard the organic maturation of all aspects, mental, aesthetic, obviously physical. We're going to grow no matter what, right? Physical is physical. It's like a fruit, vegetable. it'll mature, ripen, and die. That's not voluntary, but I mean, whether we choose to mature our minds and our hearts, that is much more.
And the way we then use technology, because technology is just a tool. And so it comes down to our ability but we have to develop our psycho-spiritual selves in order to use it most ethically and most efficaciously, where it doesn't necessarily hurt us or hurt other individuals. And that's
the big challenge.
That's the big challenge.
We are a tool-making species. Indeed, that is a big part of our ability to survive and predict the future and store food and all these sort of things. You're a tool maker too. You made a tool for people about Smedley Butler. And we're going to play it. We're going to play it later at intermission tonight. But let's talk about, why did you create it? What are you trying to do with that? Why should people care about something that happened almost 100 years ago? The business plot. I got a little context for people. War is a Racket is a book by Smedley Butler. He was the most highly decorated military participant back then. He was a U.S. Marine Corps officer, won the Congressional Medal of Honor twice. He wrote a book saying that he worked as a gangster in the military for the robber barons, and that it wasn't anything to do with really American interests or our real foreign policy. Rather, it was the foreign policy by corporate oligarchs. And he was approached by some of these people in 1934 and something that became known as the business plot. It was investigated by the McCormick-Dickstein Committee. And in there was a bunch of robber barons who were named as wanting to raise a fascist army to overtake and overthrow FDR. And they wanted Smedley Butler, the brave soldier, to lead 500,000 people. And they're like, look, you used to be our guy for, Brown Brothers Harriman and United Fruit, and used to go invade these countries and do these things. We want you to do it in your own country. And Smedley Butler was a Quaker. It was just a little bit, it was like a bridge too far. And he said, I'm going to be a whistleblower, which was an interesting thing to do back then. And he did get a stage and get his message out. So when did you learn about Smedley Butler, and what inspired you about his story?
Well, I think early on that was a story that I think I first encountered it when I listened in 2002 to Michael Moore's. Was it Michael Moore? It wasn't Michael Moore. It was somebody else, Moorish, who did a documentary called The Corporation. Oh yeah, and I liked it. I mean, I didn't really have a strong sense of conspiracies or anything, but it was a bit. It shook me up.
Yeah, I don't know who did that movie either. It's an excellent film from the early 2000s. It has a narrator that Scott Noble uses for his films. Her name's Michaela J. She has a very distinct voice. It's very like I want to say antiseptic, or it's like very sterile. It's like she presents the information, and then you
Austere
see
a little bit. Like,
and they have
sort of
those great
austere.
graphics of like looking at the corporation with the roof taken off, and you see the people inside the rooms. Like they had some really cool effects in that movie, and it made a big splash. But I never found out who made that back then.
Yeah, no, I actually have it. I could find out later. But anyway, there was a small little section, and in it, they didn't do too much of this history about that period of the Great Depression, but they did have this little snip where they had Smedley Butler himself speaking, and there's that famous clip that people can watch on YouTube, listening to General Butler himself. Now he's retired. He's retired when he's saying this in 1935, breaking down for the American audience the exact nature of the coup plot that he was being recruited to, how he played along. I mean, he wanted to just basically see how far this went up the ladder of power. He took names, and then when the time was right, he basically went to Congress, and he had a journalist that he had recruited to be with him and to be a part of his discussions with Grayson Prevost Murphy and many other high-level people who were tied to the J.P. Morgan machine. The Prescott Bush apparatus around Brown Brothers was also very integrated into this whole thing. But you had a whole fascist network inside the United States, tied to Wall Street, tied to a lot of the same industrial, power players who were funding the growth of fascism throughout the 1920s and 30s, who had people like Henry Luce put, Mussolini on Time magazine's cover like 6 times or something by 1933, really just selling the idea to the American people that if you want to end the Great Depression, all you have to do is give up certain elements of your constitution and your traditions in order to have bread on your table. And that just means, accepting the fact that George Washington really was a fascist. So you had these George Washington, swastika rallies in Madison Square Garden and down, Fifth Avenue. And we had things like that in Quebec as well. I mean, there's pictures that a lot of grandparents are still very nervous to look at from the 30s in Canada, where you had, Nazi rallies marching down the streets, not big things.
They had it here in Madison Square Garden is the famous one where you can see these big posters of like the Nazi George Washington. And there was a big Nazi supporting contingent also in the British monarchy.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
The king that had to step down and abdicate. He was
Oswald Mosley was the head of the British Union of Fascists, and King Edward.
Oh, you watching Peaky Blinders? What's going on there?
Yeah, they are. They weaved them into the storyline there too. Yeah, that was fun. But yeah, this guy's from Eton, right? Just like Julian Huxley. It's from Aldous Huxley. Sorry, it's from Eton. Like all of them go through something weird in Eton that they're processed through, and then they become something strange when they go out into the real world and become high level managers for the oligarchy. But Oswald Mosley, he was ready to take over at a certain point, and it was only with the forced abdication of Edward the VIII, who taught young Elizabeth the Hitler salute, that recently went famous as a little video clip.
Yep.
And there was generally speaking, it's important for people to, I think, look at history from the standpoint of what didn't happen, but what could have, rather than just trying to string together what did happen as trivia on a timeline. That's useless. It gives you no insight into what's going on in your own world, right? But if you look at all of the things that could have been a lot worse or could have been a lot better, right? Things that should have been better if we just didn't have the sabotage of Kwame Nkrumah, right? A CIA overthrow that artificially intervened to disrupt history, or the killing of JFK, or, the ouster of Henry Wallace from the vice presidency, right? If you didn't have these subversions by something that most historians are taught to ignore or pull out of their models of history, which is the existence of a continuous oligarchical system of, we call it deep state today, some people, but you have a continuous oligarchical process that goes back to ancient times. As far as I could see, it's an unbroken process. If maybe some families come in, some go, there are certain continuous traditions, modes of thinking, ways of thinking about cosmology, the nature of human beings that are meant to be controlled by a master class of alphas. This is just, it goes back to ancient Babylon and before, and it's still there today under new veneers, but it's the same thing. But if you don't treat that, history looks like a very strange sequence of random events, and what caused the war? Oh, well, the peace before the war caused the war. There was too much peace and thus there was a war, right? What ended the depression? What caused the Renaissance? It was the Depression was before the Renaissance. So I guess the Depression, or the Dark Age was before the Renaissance. So I guess the Dark Age caused the Renaissance, because I guess people just had to have just enough scarcity to want to have technology and educate the orphans because whatever, they were just, and so you get these lazy, stupid things with books written and PhD theses and everything about like how the Dark Ages cause renaissances or how wars cause economic progress, just because they're looking at it from the standpoint of,
wet streets cause rain.
Wet streets cause rain. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you could say, well, the dry streets came later when the sun came up, so wet streets caused dry streets. And it's like, well, the global cooling. Well, like a lot of people in the ecological community have had to admit that there actually is this disturbing thing of the great warming pause since 1999. There was like a 17-year sort of slowing down, or if not almost complete halt to the warming cycle that had begun in 77. And the way that, I kid you not, like you could actually listen to high-level PhDs trying to explain away this troublesome thing that didn't show up on any of their forecasts, any of their linear extrapolation computer models. They said, well, yeah, okay, the cooling, you see, the warming caused the cooling because there was a heat, and they'll have to like they retool their argument. And they're like, oh, there's a heat sink you see in the bottom of the ocean.
Say anything for money.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh yeah, it's the same thing with like relativity theory right now. It's like, mathematicians love it because they're going to have a job forever because there's so many anomalies in cosmology right now when it comes to like neutron stars and the issues of black
and
holes.
You can make
and
up
Big
a
Bang
new
cosmology
thing
is a big mess, so you cannot.
The old thing that doesn't exist.
Right. You could actually just come up with a more rational theory that's more grounded in reality. Or you could just continue to support a broken model and trying to fit, that's the prescriptive idea where you try to fit the evidence into a sort of a pre-prescribed idea of how things should be based on, the who you want to prop up from the past, whether we're talking about science or religion or technology, or could be any aspect of human endeavor.
Yeah. So all that to say, to weave that back into the Smedley Butler thing. So that was the thing that most people, when they're looking at trying to figure out these anomalies of history, they don't take into consideration that sometimes the oligarchy screws up. It's not like we just have a new world order effort to try to like create a great reset today, and it's never been done before. It's like there's actually key pregnant moments, these singularities, these like when you're bending a stick, right? Not all moments are equal because that tension is building up and it's going to snap. And that's, I think, like the contour of like space-time of history. You have these moments of potential that snap. And one of those key moments was around the 30s when things could have gone a very different direction. It could have gotten a lot better, but it could have got a lot worse. But you had people who stepped in. They had courage. And in the case of Britain, I think it was less courage and more practicality, because at the time you had people like Leo Amery, who was a major controller of the Round Table movement. And he was one of the key figures who recognized that Hitler was increasingly becoming a little unwieldy as a battering ram, that they wanted to use him, and fascism as a whole, right? They wanted to use its expression in every nation as a way to have enforcers to create a banker's dictatorship. And Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, whenever you look a little bit above the show, you always have the same City of London, the same Wall Street financiers working behind the scenes, bringing in eugenics as a new neo-Darwinian
and that's the key, the
science.
Eugenics. Yeah, they really seem to prop up eugenics in Hitler's Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. It's beyond just the fascistic movement, the elements of economics associated with it. They were into sort of control of biology, that like they really wanted to sort of take reins of evolutionary process, and that's what's so terrifying. Yeah, they literally want
Dr.
to be
Frankenstein
God.
and Ingolstadt. That might be a representation for the Illuminati by Mary Shelley, but we won't talk about that here.
Well, that's what fashion's a facade for like this. Essentially, to me, these eugenics movements, these top-down collectivist eugenics movements that they were using as test environments. That's the way I looked at it. These are test environments, much the way Ukraine, I think, in some capacity is
that could be scuttled. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So then the question becomes, well, why didn't they win? Like, why didn't they get their great reset, New World Order, post-nation state, depopulation system of eugenics back then, when they came so close and they put so many resources from World War I, I think, is a good inflection moment when you had the League of Nations being brought online. around the same time that the Round Table movement was
Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot. You have the divvying up of the entire Middle East at that point. Yeah.
Chatham House was being created with the Majesty Hotel, with the CFR as well, 1919, right? All
Bolshevik
1919
Revolution.
Yeah, the Bolshevik Revolution.
That was that had just been finalized.
The famous train ride. Trotsky.
Yeah, they really wanted their Trotsky guy in there. That was their key guy. They really wanted in as their permanent dude.
And if you think about it, it's just the end the Eastern Front. So there was like a pragmatic standpoint from the German side, from my understanding, which is why the Germans were willing to send the Trotsky agents into Russia in order to foment revolution, which is terrifying to think about, but pragmatic on the side of the Germans, because you think about the next 100 years. You talk about those inflection points. There's this points of tension. That's in a way another one, because the next 100 years now we have the USSR, and then you have this Cold War, which is, well, I'll stay away from talking about that right now, because there's a lot there.
Bugs. Yeah, pizza bugs. So
it didn't have to happen, though. I mean, I think that's the thing we kind of take for granted, is like, we're told all of these things happened and they had to happen that way because you have this deterministic way of history that discounts the existence of free will at all completely. It's like, it happened and thus it had to be that way. And it's like, whoa, well, what if JFK had not been killed after 3 years? What if, Henry Wallace had been able to stay in as vice president and become president? What if FDR wasn't, I think likely murdered? And Stalin totally agrees, or agreed with that assessment, and told Elliot Roosevelt, FDR's son, right, that Churchill's people killed your father. But so, like, if history didn't get derailed on all of these occasions, what sorts of policy orientation was being brought online at those moments that you had these abortions of something good? Because you could read it, you could look at and see, well, what was being discussed at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in '44. Well, the American delegation was at war with the British delegation. It was not like an Anglo-American hugfest trying to plan out how do they reconquer the world. No, it was a total, like, 2-week-long drawn-out battle between eugenicist, world government freak, pedophile John Maynard Keynes, versus Harry Dexter White and a lot of the American delegation, who were defending the right of Africa, India, South America, Brazil, China. The Chinese delegation had a whole program for developing Tennessee Valley Authority projects based on the revival of Sun Yat-sen's program for the international development of China that Sun Yat-sen had drafted in 1919. They brought that back alive with all of the New Deal policies as they would look if they would be permitted to actually happen, to end hunger and all of these other things, and really leapfrog into the 21st century back in 1944. And it was being supported, defended by the U.S. delegation. Same thing for Brazil. They drafted they presented all of their plans. They got full support, and it was only the British who were fighting against that every step of the way, trying to maintain the idea that no, we need a Bancor, one world currency. We got to have it under the control of the Bank of International Settlements. And people don't even know that there was a vote that was a near unanimous vote, except for the British delegation at Bretton Woods, to audit and then dissolve the Bank of International Settlements at that conference.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it didn't happen. FDR died. They purged every single patriot who understood the Wall Street apparatus that had tried to get the Bankers Coup in 1934 with Butler, that tried to kill Roosevelt in 1933 in February using a Freemasonic, expendable Giuseppe Zangara, who I go through in the video. There was a patriotic organization within America that had a lot of influence within the OSS that were at odds with this other Anglo-American CFR-connected deep state, grouping of zombies. They didn't get along. And it was only with the expulsion of those patriots under, they were all dubbed like red commies, like Dexter White and Wallace. They were all dubbed, they were crushed under the Cold War period. But that didn't have to happen. They could have had that policy actually be permitted to come alive, but it didn't. And so we got the other thing instead of the OSS being dissolved, bombs being dropped unnecessarily on a defeated Japan and everything else. Everyone knows this. And Churchill comes and lives in the White House for a month and declares the Iron Curtain, based on a Nazi foreign minister ideology. Like, it was the Nazi foreign minister who first laid out the Iron Curtain strategy like 3 months before Churchill even made it public. So it's like, no, this is, most of history is a giant disgusting abortion of the good. It wasn't necessary in any step of the way.
Just didn't have to happen this way.
Didn't have to happen. Yeah.
But it takes up a lot of effort.
Like where are the weaknesses in the Great Reset today? You know, when you think about it that way, you're like, okay, it's not these immutable godlike forces of evil that have always controlled everything, and there's been no opposition, there's been no weakness, no, there's shit that keeps them up at night. You know, they've got insecurities.
Right. So people in Europe don't have to freeze and starve this winter, and people all over the world don't have to starve, right? Because it doesn't have to be zero carbon. It doesn't have to be ESG. It doesn't have to be Great Reset. That's just their offer, and everyone's just accepting it because they haven't really thought about what it means. And the people who are doing it, they know what it means. It means shutting off everybody's everything and letting everyone just fight it out while they go off to their super mansions and bunkers and stuff.
Yeah,
I think we can do better. And I think their sales pitch is pretty shitty. And we're going to need something to compare it to, though. And I think it looks like freedom, and they want to censor and alienate anybody who has something to say other than Great Reset and eat the bugs.
Yeah, or eat the wind turbines.
Yeah,
actually, right?
I see lots of people in our chat making fun of the wind. I'm like, what? I just picked up on that right now. There's apparently
they like turned it into resin. So they got some scientists to figure out how do you turn the materials of the windmills into like a resin that you can infuse into gummy bears and eat gummy bear windmills that were like being recycled into your body. It's like a thing that they're actually doing.
That's crazy. I didn't think they'd take like Snowpiercer being like this movie from a Korean director where they're in a train and it's global warming and it's essentially eating the bugs quite literally. Like, oh no, we're gonna that's a great plan. Why don't we just take that metaphor and apply it to reality?
All right. Well, before we let you go, Matt, I want to show you this book. I've teased the audience enough. Last week, somebody in the chat said, "Hey, there's this book, Two Faces of George Bush." I said, "I've never heard of it." And I was incredulous. I was like, if Anthony Sutton wrote that book, I would know about it. And sure enough, it's a real book. And they looked it up online, and Control Room was showing me that the one copy available, they wanted $45,000 for it. So like the next day, I mentioned it to my wife. She finds a copy that's online that's not $45,000. Thankfully, it was under $100. And I'm going to open it for you. Let's see if I can zoom in just a little bit. Let's do this. See if we can get a whole page on screen at once. Something like doing it live, everybody, doing it live, something like this. All right. Two Faces of George Bush by Anthony C. Sutton. And this is brought to us in 1988 and by the same author. So you can see what books he had written by that time. So he's not all the way through his Wall Street series, right, which would have been Wall Street and FDR. Mm-hmm. And in the Order series, this turned out to be his introduction to Skull and Bones, America's Secret Establishment. So, like, I bought How the Order Controls Education as a little pamphlet book like this one, and it was $80 20 years ago. And then I found out it was actually Chapter 8 in a book that I could get for $20. So these are little artifacts of the author. The official face of George Bush. He goes through, gives you like the official biography from the White House, and here's who this guy is. And then he starts to dig in, because he's a war hero and stuff. Phi Beta Kappa. So then he goes into the establishment links, breaks down all the people he went to school with, was in the military with, their connections with Skull and Bones and the establishment. A lot of Harriman, eugenics, funding of Hitler people, also the same people that were just participating in that coup against FDR. And Prescott Bush's interests were funding Soviet Union and Nazi Germany because they had a oil company called Dresser. I think it's Dresser Industries. And they provided oil machinery to Stalin's Soviet Union, much like the Koch brothers' father did. Sutton goes through this other part where it's just all about Skull and Bones, brings up this points about Gary Trudeau, who's a Skull and Bones guy, and Doonesbury, and some of the cartoons that they wrote during the time. Bush, the oil man. So Zapata was one of his oil companies, and they also had Operation Zapata, CIA. But Zapata had, in the 80s, like 7,300 people working for it, $5 billion company.
You know what Bush Sr. chose to call one of the key projects in the early 70s, Operation Hammer?
Oh, okay,
like 1990, 91?
Yeah.
It was based on Arm & Hammer. And
Armand Hammer was the chairman of Communist Party USA back in the day.
Well, he was also kind of like the George Soros of Russia of the 20s. So as soon as they went for the new economic plan in was it 1919 under Trotsky, and you had a big giant rush of mass privatization across Russia, like the idea, free enterprise, all this stuff, but it was all a giant veneer just to get an oligarch control over the state-run operations, and that was the 20s. And Armand Hammer was the key guy managing that as doing currency speculation, running a lot. Like he had a multifaceted operation, bringing in Prescott, Bush, a lot of other people. I don't know if actually no. Let me press pause on Prescott. I don't know about him, but a lot of the
Al
worst
Gore's
elements.
family got it from Armand Hammer.
What's that?
The Occidental Petroleum was controlled by Armand Hammer. Western Petroleum, it was called Occidental Petroleum, and that's where Al Gore's family got their. That's where his dad got their money working.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, over
when
the
you
coal
see the
mines in Tennessee.
politicians today, then be like, hey, what was their dad and grandfather doing during these big pivotal events back in the past? I thought you'd like this part. This is on page 35. And down here, it's talking about Bush as ambassador to the United Nations, 1971. It said, yet as we shall see later, the Bush family and associates in such firms as Dresser Industries has been a prime supporter of building the Soviet oil industry, the Soviets' largest supplier of foreign exchange, and a means of financing world imperialism and terrorism. Communist China apparently did not agree with Bush. He remained only a year in China as envoy. But the point is brought up later. He's accused of setting up opium and heroin trafficking in China at that time by a Green Beret from the army. The testimonies later in this book, but let me just cover this other part. Bush as an internationalist, anti-American. So he had this globalist design known as mondialization, like worldization, and to make world cities. And they started doing this back in Ohio. So mondialization is no more than a polite subversion. The first American city to join the New World Order by the mondialization process was Richfield, Ohio in 1970. So apparently this type of thing's been going on a long time. And there's an official official statement about the UN Charter there. He then goes, here's the logo for that city, Richfield, Ohio.
Ohio. Who'd have thought?
And mentions David Rockefeller and a whole bunch of other good little clips. Here's a good part. At one time, Bush was a member of the elitist, powerful Council on Foreign Relations, and as a member of the similarly internationalist Atlantic Council, made a statement supporting the known admitted goals of the Atlantic Council, i.e. world government. So even back then, Sutton knew Atlantic Council is world government. Atlantic Council is telling Facebook what to do these days, right? So for people to say there's nothing to see there, man, it's just Mark Zuckerberg. People have been given the illusion of interdependence, but in fact, the interdependence is not much greater than the previous eras. So even though they were saying they were breaking out, and making changes, it was more of the same. He's molded in the image
of oligarchy
of Nelson Rockefeller, a good Nazi supporter back then himself, not just the banking with the Bush families and the Harrimans. More Nazi stuff. So this was 1988. This is when George H.W. Bush was running for president. Sutton puts out this book as like a Hail Mary to be like, hey, for the people out there who know how to read, here's some interesting stuff on Bush. Anyway, it's only 96 pages, and I'm pretty sure you can find it in maybe Wall Street and FDR.
There's a really good one I had read around that time too, the unauthorized biography of
the Webster Tarpley one.
Tarpley and Chaikin, they co-wrote that. That one's quite good. It's pretty thorough. And that was actually one of the first expositions I really had that satisfied my reason after watching I mentioned the corporation that brought up Smedley Butler, but they really took it way deeper than I expected it could possibly go. And that's like a 700-page tome. It's thorough.
Yeah, Anton Chaikin does good research as well. And I think, didn't Tarpley get sued over that book good. Or what?
No, not that book. Tarpley got sued over something he said about Melania Trump or something.
Oh, geez, yeah.
And then he came out of that process with like a melted brain, and now he's like pro-Biden, and I don't know what happened to him. It's weird.
Yeah,
it's unfortunate.
But his historical, so a lot of his older research, I mean, we talked. Yeah, it really is. It really is.
So look at the message.
I'd mapped out the whole
not the
Venetian
messenger.
oligarchy thanks to Rich, and that was 10 years ago. Because I was like, I don't have this on my brain. You do it. So I still have that somewhere. The brain software we were using, but it was incredible research, and it's actually only been corroborated with other resources I've used many years later. Which in fact, I keep thinking about that time when I was doing that research. I'm like, I'd really like to go back and I need to revisit that. I have been, but sort of intermittently. So
yeah, me too.
Well,
No,
Matt,
it's
I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, dude. Where can people support you and join your Substack and get your books and all that good stuff?
Yeah. Okay, they can get the books easily on CanadianPatriot.org. Little buttons everywhere saying buy books, and the Substack is useful. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to spell my name, but if you can get MatthewEhret.substack.com, there's free stuff. There's stuff you can upgrade to pay for. And finally, RisingTideFoundation.net. We do weekly seminars, lectures, symposia with various experts. We're going to have Anton Chaikin on in a couple of weeks going through some material on the untold history of the United States. And if you want to be involved or at least just get a free invite now and again, you could send me an email to info@risingtidefoundation.net, and I'll happily send you. Usually we ask for a donation, but whatever, times are tough. And we just had, like Michael Claridge on as well, the guy.
I'm a huge fan of Dr. Michael Claridge, Sapphire Project, associated. Wow. It's a separate project from the Thunderbolts project, but at least they share in the same sort of new way of viewing cosmology through plasma physics. Yeah. And it's very fascinating. It's something I've been following for years and years. I've been a big supporter of various theories around it. It's Gareth Samuel, see the pattern. There's also Ken Wheeler and his theories on magnetism, taking like Steinmetz's heavy side, James Clerk Maxwell, and see what they said about the idea of the ether and dielectric field, and what they're trying to define what electricity is, and maybe its role in vitality and then I can't help but then relate it back to the Platonic metaphysics, but that's where I go. So
absolutely. No, it's good soul food. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for people on YouTube, you're Canadian Patriot, also on YouTube, right?
Yeah, but I only put a fraction of my content on YouTube, the safest of the safest stuff. So yeah, they can go to Bitchute or Rumble, but when they go to the Canadian Patriot website, if they can make that bookmark that, the content always ends up showing up on there.
All right, right on.
If you join the Rising Tide Foundation, you'll get access to, you do private lectures. You also have, it's almost like town halls we do for our community in regards to sharing information, going over deep dives into various historical analyses. We're covering some of your articles. You do a lot of really incredible work. I haven't jumped on live, but I've watched the replays you posted, and I'm really impressed by what you have going on over there.
Rising Tide raises all ships. Hey, Tony, can you have Matt on for town hall in a couple weeks? We could do like more detailed deep dive than we can do on the show here.
If he's interested, I absolutely would love that. That'd be amazing. Yeah. And we can sort of go over some of your articles. And
how is that different from what we're doing right now? Like I just feel like we're just
it's nerdier. It's like 10 times nerdier.
It's actually what you do with your audience in a way. It's just more intimate because we're going to have people from the community have access to their microphones and video, and they'll get to share with us, and have a dialectic back. Yeah, exactly.
The use of words like metaphysics, epistemology, identification are much more used in the town hall than it is probably during the show. This is more
get the flex on an intellectual muscle more in the town hall than I do.
And it's more like the high dive.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. No, call me in. I'll happily join. Say the word.
That's fantastic. I would love that. So we'll be in contact. I'll email you. So.
All right. Keep up the great work, Matt, and then let you get to bed.
All right.
Have a good week.
Peace. Have a good night, Matt.
Bye, guys.
All right. That was fantastic.
Always. He's amazing. Incredible researcher.
He's got a big brain, dude. He's just like letting it flow.
He's like you, though. His rhetorical capabilities are incredible. His recall, but then his way to weave a narrative together to make sense when he's speaking. To speak both with diffidence and the sense of humility, but also with conviction when he understands something, and the process of the Socratic method by asking questions. I mean, it's very unique. It takes a lot of self-development and work on oneself to be able to develop that sort of skill, but anyone has the capacity to do so. And kudos to him for pointing out his sort of methodology of how he goes about composition, narrative, interviews and these sorts of things. I think that's really important, and just always appreciate the work.
Well, I'm glad he's got someone doing some AV. So like Corbett has Brock West,
Right.
So now Matthew's got this guy that's helping him. We'll check it out during the intermission later tonight. It's like a 20-minute micro documentary, kind of Jake Tran style, micro documentary. Get some good knowledge on. Doesn't have to take 3 hours or 6 hours or 12 hours or 20 hours, as some episodes have been of other things.
Should stimulate one's curiosity to go read a book.
Yeah. And don't forget change screen. There you go.
Former President Donald Trump announced his intention to run in the 2024 elections, which is a no-brainer considering his support among potential Republican contenders is 49%, compared to a 25% support rate for DeSantis, and no other candidate earning above 7%. It didn't take 2 days before Defense Authorization Act of 2022 was passed by the House of Representatives, giving the president full control over the military and all domestic operations, and which takes direct aim at all domestic extremists in the USA. The senile and politically compromised Biden's days in power are shaky to say the least. A cause to eliminate the obviously decrepit puppet who is quickly losing any claim to usefulness for his handlers is increasing.
Look, maybe I'm kidding myself, but as time goes on, the voter who is just trying to figure out, as I said, how to take care of their family, put 3 squares on the table, stay safe, be able to pay their mortgage or their rent, etc., is becoming much more informed on the motives of some of the political players and some of the political parties.
These broad, unconstitutional powers assumed by the executive may easily be used by whatever fascist power is brought into play as Biden's replacement. These events echo the 1933 Reichstag fire that provided a newly elected Hitler regime the excuse it needed to impose tyrannical, enabling acts. With the perfect storm of crises now converging onto our beleaguered world, economic meltdown, energy crisis, food crisis, and general dangers of both civil and global wars, it is worth considering the very real possibility that the days of elections may soon be over. Despite the many talking heads yapping about the 2024 elections as if it were a football game, reality and real history paint a very different picture of bankers' directed military coups, both in the USA and abroad. We will revisit the 1932 to 1934 efforts by the international deep state to impose a fascist dictatorship upon Americans, and even overthrow the elected government of Franklin Roosevelt with a J.P. Morgan-funded military coup d'etat. (1932 to 1934) was a period of history that saw the world torn down into a deep depression, which the people of Europe and America were told by their media could only be solved by the economic miracle solution of a new system of governments known as fascism. This fascist economic solution took hold in Europe with the quick rise of Nazism, Franco and Mussolini's corporatism, as well as what later became Vichy France. In English Canada, the League for Social Reconstruction, founded by 5 Rhodes Scholars, was ready to take power in 1932. And French-speaking Canada was quickly embracing the Nazi-inspired political party of Adrian Arcand. The British governing class, led by the royal family, were fully backing Nazism, and Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists was rising faster than ever. All of these movements came in different flavors, but were united under a cold, utilitarian philosophy of government, a devout love for eugenics, the racist science of populist control, and addiction to City of London Wall Street money. In the United States, however, things weren't going as smoothly. Even though the financial elite of Wall Street had pulled the plug on the system 4 years earlier, the population had still not broken sufficiently to accept fascism as the solution which Time magazine told them it was. Instead, the people voted for one of the few anti-fascist presidential candidates available in 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt was elected under the theme of taking the moneylenders out of power and restoring the Constitution. In his March 4, 1933 inaugural address, FDR stated,
"Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion. Faced by failure of credit, they have proposed only the lending of more money. Stripped of the lure of profit by which to induce our people to follow their false leadership, they have resorted to exhortation, pleading tearfully for restored confidence. They have no vision, and when there is no vision, the people perish. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truth. The measure of that restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values, more noble than mere monetary profit."
During FDR's famous 100 days, an all-out war was declared on the economic royalists that had taken over the nation. Audits and investigations were conducted on the banks in the form of the Pecora Commission, and the biggest financial houses, which had spent billions on fascist parties of Europe, were broken up, while speculation was reined in under Glass-Steagall. Meanwhile, a new form of banking was unveiled more in alignment with America's constitutional traditions, in the form of productive credit and long-term public works, which created real jobs and increased the national productive powers of labor. Many people remain totally ignorant that even before his March 4, 1933 inauguration, Franklin Roosevelt narrowly avoided an assassination attempt in Florida, which saw 5 people struck by bullets, and the mayor of Chicago dying of his wounds 3 weeks later. Within days of the mayor's death, the assassin, Giuseppe Zingara, was speedily labeled a lone gunman and executed without any serious investigation into his Freemasonic connections. This, however, was just a precursor for an even greater battle, which Wall Street financiers would launch in order to overthrow the presidency later that year. This effort would only be stopped by the courageous intervention of a patriotic Marine named Smedley Butler. Born in 1881 to a family of patriotic Quakers, Smedley Butler quickly rose through the ranks of the military, becoming the most decorated military figure of U.S. history, a record he holds to this day with multiple Medals of Honor, an Army Distinguished Service Medal, and Marine Corps Brevet Medal, to name just a few. By the end of the British orchestrated meat grinder known as World War I, the general had become an activist patriot, giving speeches across America in denunciation of the private financiers steering America's war-driven economy. Speaking to veterans in August 1933, the general said,
"I have spent 33 years being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1916. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenue in. I helped rape half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. In China, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. I had a swell racket. I was rewarded with honors, medals, and promotions. I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate a racket in 3 cities. The Marines operated on 3 continents."
In spite of his outspoken criticism of crony capitalism, Wall Street's elite simply presumed all men had their price, and Butler was probably just indignant because he was never given a big enough piece of the pie. These financiers needed someone like Butler to channel the rage of the striking veterans of World War I across America, who had been fighting for the bonus pay promised them years earlier, but which didn't exist due to the 1929 collapse. A force of hundreds of thousands of disgruntled seasoned soldiers was exactly what was needed to overthrow Roosevelt. But leadership was sorely lacking, and General Butler was their man for the job. He was a war hero who was seen as honest and loved by the veterans. He was perfect. Before continuing, it would benefit us all to recall that the American Legion was a very different beast from the benign organization of old veterans it is known as today. As it was originally founded with Wall Street capital in 1919 and was run early on as a fascist machine, Legion Commander Alvin Owsley made this explicit in 1921 when he said,
"If need be, the American Legion is ready to protect the institutions of this country and its ideals, in the same way as the fascists have treated the destructive forces threatening Italy. Don't forget that the fascists are, for today's Italy, what the American Legion is for the United States."
In reply to whether this meant taking over the government, he said,
"Exactly that."
Under the guiding hand of J.P. Morgan's Grayson Prevost Murphy, two representatives of the American Legion, Commander Bill Doyle and bond salesman Gerald McGuire, approached Butler in July 1933 for the job of rallying the Legion's veterans and began dropping hints of a larger coup plot. Butler became suspicious, but continued playing along with the plan to see how far this went up the ladder of power. Over the course of the next several months, Butler discovered that America's financial elite centered around John Pierpont Morgan Jr., the Harrimans, the Mellons, Warburgs, Rockefellers, and DuPonts, all at the heart of the plot. These men used their agents such as Gerald McGuire, the Morgan-affiliated bond salesman, Democratic Party controllers John W. Davis and Thomas Lamont, both occupying directorships in the House of Morgan, Robert Sterling Clark, heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, Grayson Prevost Murphy, and Harriman family investment banker Prescott Bush. All of these characters have become well-known investors in European fascism, owned the biggest media platforms including Fortune and Time magazine, both of which promoted Mussolini extensively for years and controlled the levers of industry. Luckily, the 1932 to 1934 Pecora Commission exposed these forces publicly as the architects of the Great Depression, making their ability to acquire popular support and sympathy more than a little difficult. Outlining his committee's findings, Pecora had written publicly,
Undoubtedly, this small group of highly placed financiers controlling the very springs of economic activity holds more real power than any similar group in the USA.
When the time was right, Butler blew the whistle by approaching the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, which began an investigation on November 20th, 1934. Unlike the Committee on Un-American Activities, which made its reputation destroying patriotic lives under the communist witch hunt of McCarthyism, this earlier version was aligned to FDR and dedicated solely to identifying Nazi activity in America. At first skeptical of the general's claims, the committee soon substantiated everything over the course of a month-long investigation and made their findings public to FDR and Congress on December 29, 1934. An invaluable part of the hearings were the testimonies of journalist Paul Comley French, whom Butler recruited to act as the general's intermediary with the bankers. Butler told the committee that McGuire stated it
Wouldn't take any constitutional change to authorize another cabinet official, somebody take over the details of the office, to take them off the president's shoulders.
And that
We do with him what Mussolini did to the King of Italy.
when French asked McGuire how the coup would help solve unemployment, McGuire responded,
We need a fascist government to save the nation from the communists. It was the plan that Hitler had used in putting all of the unemployed in labor camps or barracks, and forced labor. That would solve it overnight.
Although the full transcripts were not made public, Butler did get the message to the population. By giving his story to as many journalists as possible, and recorded a message to the people in 1935, which should be listened to in full.
The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institution. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institution. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
This exposure, alongside the Pecora Commission findings and earlier failed assassination attempt, gave FDR the ammunition he needed to force America's deep state into submission, at least for a while. FDR's fight to stop a central banker's dictatorship started from the earliest days of his presidency to his dying breath on April 12, 1945. Incredibly, after the sanitized and redacted 1934 report was published, the committee was disbanded, to be reformed later under a fascist mandate, and thousands of pages of transcripts were buried for years, only officially made public in the 21st century, the contents of which can be found online. The coup plotters lost no time forming a new organization on August 22, 1934, called the American Liberty League, which spent the next decade sabotaging FDR's New Deal. This group made every effort to promote an American alliance with Axis powers until 1941's Pearl Harbor attack, widely financed eugenics, and, after FDR died, acted as the driving force behind the McCarthyite police state in America during the Cold War. Without understanding this fascist deep state operation within the heart of the American establishment, it would be impossible to make sense of the Manichean Cold War dualism that destroyed FDR's vision for a world of cooperating sovereign nation-states. The American Liberty League also gave birth to such think tanks as the American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, and Cato Institute, which incrementally made Austrian school economics a part of the American right. Anyone wishing to understand what created the Frankenstein monster called neoconservatism during the last 60 years would not get very far without understanding the role of the American Liberty League and its hellspawn. Today, a new systemic meltdown of a $1.5 quadrillion derivatives bubble has similarities to the 1929 crash and other similarities to the 1923 hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic. While the specific trigger for the oncoming systemic blowout is not fully determined, what is certain is that the danger of a new fascist coup and world war are as real as ever before. With the restoration of an FBI dictatorship in the USA, not seen since the darkest days of the Cold War, and with a criminal raid on Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago home, it should be increasingly clear that the opportunities to avoid a slide into fascism are disappearing faster than the likelihood that a 2024 Democratic election will actually take place. It is now up to the American people to ensure that the lessons of history are learned quickly, and that the American experiment is not permitted to fail.